Well, good morning, everybody. Ken Frankel, I'm the president of the Canadian Council for the Americas. I'm joined today with Karen Poniachik, who's the head of Columbia University Santiago Center, to present what we think is going to be a very interesting conversation on the aftermath of the vote for the plebiscite in Chile on 2 days ago on Sunday. As most of you know who have been listening to the news and watching Chile relatively closely, on Sunday, 78% of the Chileans voted to adopt a new constitution. And of those 79%, an overwhelming majority, decided that the vehicle for doing that would be elected delegates, 155, half of who would be women by law. And now we're going to begin the process of drafting drafting not yet, but going forward with this whole constitutional process. We want to explore many, many issues that rose from the Sunday vote, before the vote, during the vote, and after the vote. With that, Karen, again, thank you for collaborating with us today. We love collaborating with you in Columbia University Santiago Center. So would you like to say a few words?
Sure, thank you, Ken. We also love collaborating with the Canadian Council for the Americas, and especially on this topic. And by the way, I should mention that we have two Columbia alumna here in the panel, Claudia and Carmen, and so we're delighted too because of that. My take is one, and maybe I'm sure you're going to be discussing it in the panel, is that the three main districts that voted against the constitutional reform are Vitacura, Las Condes, and Lo Barnechea, which is where the Chilean business and political elite live, and which shows the disconnection, once again, between the Chilean elite and Chile society as a whole. So I think that's a big challenge going forward. That's a big challenge for business. That's a big challenge also for the process of drafting the Constitution. So it'd be great if you address that in the panel. I'm sure you will do. And once again, thanks, Ken, and thanks to all the panelists.
Thank you, Karen. I'm sure Columbia wouldn't mind if we also mentioned there's a Georgetown graduate and a Dartmouth graduate on the panel. That's fine, okay? Yeah. So with us today and we're going to launch right into it, with us today, in addition to Karen, who I just introduced, we have Cristina Bitar, who's the senior partner and president of Azerta Consultants, Pamela Figueroa, who's professor at Universidad de Santiago de Chile, Claudia Heiss, who's the director of the Institute of Public Affairs at the U de Chile, and Carmen Foulon, who's a researcher at the Centro de Estudios Públicos. Thank you to all of you for joining us today. One final logistical matter I should have covered a couple of minutes ago was we will take and we'll be pleased to entertain written questions. So if you have any, please use the icon at the bottom and submit them, and we'll try and integrate those during the course of the conversation. Try and keep this to an hour. That's what it's programmed for. But we know by the overwhelming turnout and people who signed up for this that there's a great interest in it. And if we go a few minutes more, I hope everybody will forgive us. I know the panelists have said they will indulge us for a few extra minutes if we need to. I think the best way of starting today, Carmen, people know the general statistics that I outlined and Karen added some interesting ones about the three districts where there was the rechazo or the no vote. Can you talk a little bit more about, you're an expert in statistical analysis on these kinds of issues. Could you talk a little bit more about what statistics you looked at, what you found particularly interesting, what further breakdowns there may be, or what you would be interested in seeing when the breakdowns finally come, for example, youth vote, men, women, that kind of a thing, and maybe just put it into a little bit of historical context. So, sorry, that's a lot of things to ask you, Carmen, but whatever you can do with that. Thank you.
Hi, Ken. Thanks all my panelists, and hi everyone. So I'll talk briefly, and maybe we can, if something, just discuss later. So, well, as Karen mentioned, there was only in 3 counties the rechazo option won, and And there's a strong relation, like almost one, with approval and the Constitutional Convention, which the first one would be paritaria. So it's almost the same, talking about approval and Constitutional Convention. So I'll talk about approval. What I think it's interesting is it is true that we have these three in the richer neighborhoods that won rejection. But it's interesting that the historical percent of the center right on those counties is higher. So there's a significant proportion if we think there's a relation between those who voted in the past and those who voted in the future. And that's a really important question that we have to address. Like we have general numbers, but we don't know whether they had voted or not, but there's some inertia on voting. So we can assume that a lot of people that voted before had voted. So it's important to know that even though it won what I marked less than the center right has won on previous elections. And what I think is interesting in talking about this class bias, I think it's important to distinguish between the metropolitan region and the other regions. We tend to talk about the results in Santiago, and it's interesting that the patterns in the metropolitan region and the other regions are different. So we do observe, and for the first time, there's a decrease, there's an increase in participation by on poorer counties in the metropolitan region, which is a great news. We diminished the class bias in voting, so that's great. But we think we should see what happened in the other regions in the county where we do not observe this trend. So if we look at the other regions, and I apologize because I have jumped all of them together on one analysis, we do not observe that clear trend that we do observe in the metropolitan region. So I think that's an important thing to note. A second thing that I think it's important to note, we had two events like radically different, like the social outburst that mobilized probably, and that's what we need to see, is younger voters. We have a lot of anecdotal evidence that a lot of young people voted for first time, but we really want to see it on the data. And we have, on the other hand, the pandemic, which we think has depressed the voter turnout among the older population and those at risk. Plus, we have the problem that people that had COVID were not allowed to vote. So that's a big issue that we need to look at. And if we look we divide the counties by the step in which they were. Quarantines counties had a lower turnout rate than non-quarantines voters, but there's a pattern that we should look is that those that were in step 4 had a lower turnout. So probably there's some things in those regions that we need to address more, probably other correlates. So my final take is that we need to look into a lot of factors to understand the behavior. So.
And thank you, Carmen. Just a follow-up question. The voter turnout was in the vicinity of 50%. Is that accurate?
It's a really great news that in the middle of the pandemic, we had a higher turnout than the last election. It's great news that we had higher turnout in many counties with usually low turnout. So those are very great news, and it increases, but also it didn't change much in other parts of the country, and we need to study that as well.
Yeah, and so if you take into account the exigencies and the circumstances you recommended, folks with COVID, elderly, well, the whole issue surrounding COVID, this was an impressive turnout, particularly by Chilean standards, right? I mean, yeah. So that 50% one could imagine would have been a lot larger. Okay, well, Pam, let me ask you: does any of this news come as a surprise to you? Is this about what you would have thought? I mean, the polls were predicting about this measure of victory for the apruebo, but in terms of bigger turnout, sort of in the poorer areas in the metropolitan area, why do you think that might be? Can you speculate on that? Pamela, do you want to?
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Actually, it is very interesting that in the poor neighborhoods, people vote more than past elections. But for example, in some neighborhood, it's La Pintana, the mayor of that municipality take a very important role to promoting his neighbors to vote in this election. So I think that is also because of the leadership of some mayors and some social leaders that promote the importance of this election to change some problems, very big problems in Chile, as Karen and Carmen say, that is not just a class bias in the elections, in the election participation, but it's also because of the very high income inequality in Chile. Yeah, it's not just the distance between elites and the people. We have a very big problem about income inequality, and that income inequality is showing also in the elections. And I think that this election is very important, and the results of the participation in this election is important for that issue, because people from poor areas of the metropolitan region and also in urban popular areas in regions, not just Santiago and other regions, decide to participate and to show his discontent with the system through elections, through the institutional and democratic institutions. I agree with Carmen that we don't have enough information, enough data today to see what really happened in other regions. And that is another issue in Chile, that the very centralized power is a very centralized elite also. The elite in the metropolitan region also centralized powers related with other elites in regions. We have to also see what happened in rural areas that, as I see in rural areas, less people vote in this election. So it is very interesting how the income inequality problem in Chile is a political issue today.
Thank you, Pam. Claudia, if I'm not mistaken, I didn't check this morning, but even in those 3 districts that voted for the rechazo, the margins weren't that overwhelming, if I'm not mistaken. And you obviously you would know the statistics, and Carmen, everybody on the panel would know. But if what I believe is more or less accurate, that's an interesting development in and of itself, right? I mean, how do you view the results in the context of those 3 districts, for example, that voted the way they did, but not with the widest of margins? Does that represent basically a general consensus, even amongst most people, that this was a necessary step that Chile had to take?
I think it does. I think the result of the election shows a very across the party lines agreement that we need to change the constitution. The approval for constitutional change, it cannot be translated into the left and right traditional divide. And as you say, even in the 3 areas where the vote was for the rejection of the constitution making process won, there was still a significant vote for the approval. And so I think that what's very impressive in the electoral result is this 80-20 balance in the country, which is very unusual. It's an anomaly in elections. Usually elections are won by smaller margins. So I think this plebiscite, as we call it, or referendum, as is better known in other countries, this referendum really shows a very broad social agreement, national agreement, that we need to change the constitution. And not even the plebiscite in 1988 to end the Pinochet dictatorship was as massive, as consensus based as this result. And I think maybe one of the reasons is what was mentioned before, this divide between elites and citizenry. I have to say, just to finish with these 3 neighborhoods, that some people who would have probably voted for the rejection did not go to vote. So as we saw in La Pintana, a poor neighborhood, young people voting who had never voted before, we saw a decrease in traditionally high voting areas. So the areas where 70% voted in the last presidential election went down to 60%. Some people probably did not want to go to vote, perhaps because they knew they didn't have a chance, the rejection didn't have a chance. All the polls beforehand show around a 70-30 relationship between approval and rejection. So the people that did not want constitutional change, I think, didn't go to vote in those three neighborhoods. But the fact that many young people who were protesting did go to vote, because in Chile we always say people march in the streets, but they don't go to vote. There's a divorce between social mobilization through social movements and protests and electoral participation. In this case, I think the social protest may have fed the electoral process. So some people who marched saw this referendum as a conquest of the social movement, and therefore were more inclined to go to vote than in other elections. Another element that may have made those people vote is the fact that they were not choosing people. They were not voting for politicians. They were just voting for a structural change. So in a sense, this is more like a destituting process. So the question now is, how will this work when it's no longer a matter of destituting, but of constituting? So will these people who voted to change the constitution go to vote for the representatives to make the new constitution? I think that's a big question. And I think that rejects this, one last thing, I think this idea that many people do not want to vote for politicians, this rejection of the political elites, was also shown in the result for the Constitutional Convention as opposed to the mixed Constitutional Convention. That was a big surprise to me. That was not what the polls said beforehand. We all expected a big difference between approval and rejection, but we didn't expect such a big difference between mixed Constitutional Convention and the elected Constitutional Convention. And I think that's also a signal against political elites, because people clearly don't want Congress people to create a new constitution.
Claudia, you raised two questions we are definitely going to come back to. One is exactly the alienation between the political class and everybody, or the citizenry in Chile, and in the youth vote, which is something that Canadian Council for the Americas has been very, very active in following in Chile, and an event we did in Colombia as well. But I want to bring in Cristina. Thank you for waiting, Cristina. Thanks for your patience. The three areas that voted rechazo, again, as we established, though not overwhelmingly so, were the affluent areas. And those theoretically, or more than theoretically, are the areas where investors, the folks who, the economic motors, as it were, of Chile, many of them would be living. There was a lot of conversation ahead of time that a yes vote would chill foreign investment in Chile, that investors would get scared, foreign investors might get scared or play a wait and see attitude, and to see how this whole process unfolds. And even domestic investors were going to hold back some of their spending. What's your sense of that now? Or what was your sense of it before the election? And what signals do you seem to be getting now after the plebiscite, I should say?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. First of all, I'm glad to be in the panel with all these fantastic women. So thank you for this, for Colombia and the Canadian Council. I think what happened on Sunday was a historical moment for Chile. It was a hopeful and happy day for most Chileans. 80% voted approval. And it was a democratic, peaceful, historical day that is, I think, the beginning of a new phase in history in Chile. Where that turns out is something I cannot predict right now, but definitely we had record participation in all high numbers ever in Chile, even with voluntary vote and in the middle of COVID, like all the rest of the panel said. And what is most amazing, that is that basically the 100% constitutional convention won also by almost 80%. So people, what I think you can see is who won. The citizens won, those who marched won, the social movement won, the young people won, and obviously it was, I think the best is that it was very intense, and 80% is no one can question whether everybody wants change. So we can say that almost all Chileans want change in general. Let's start with the new rules of the game, which is the Constitution. And I think this has been happening for almost, strongly for more than a year. I was with you, Kenneth, in another panel where I was saying that the social explosion and outburst in October was an amazing, unexpected for many, especially the elites, but nothing that happened this Sunday can surprise us. This started a long time ago. The disconnection between elites and citizens and the rest has been there for many years. I think it's been there forever. I saw numbers yesterday that in the referendum of 1988, the same 3 districts voted the same way. So basically, nothing has changed, which is probably why everybody wants change now. It's been a lot of time with no change. I think young people won, like I was saying. And in terms of investors, I don't think Sunday was a bad day. I think it's a good day for investors because the last year has been very tough. We had the social outbreak, and then we had COVID, and Chile, I personally think, is today facing the worst social, political, and economic crisis due to COVID in the last 35 years. And this is this winning of the approve position gives us an institutional path to try to reconstruct Chile. And in that reconstruction, I think institutional investors or investors in general should be hopeful. Why? There's going to be a lot of uncertainty in the next 2-3 years. There's going to be 8 or 9 elections. The whole panorama of the political scene in Chile will change, but that is better than where we were before, because at least we're moving. So for investors, what happened on Sunday should not be a problem. I don't see they will stop. I think the April election of the 155 constituyentes and the people that will form that constitutional assembly is more important. If in April you see a very strong tendency to have a very left communist or anti-system candidates there, then we should get worried. But I don't think this is the time, and I think April is really the most important election. I'll stop there because there's probably other things everybody wants to say, but let me stop.
No, that's great. Intervene anytime you want. Let's go back to this youth question. As Carmen started off saying that she had the sense, I don't think she had the hard statistical data yet. And Carmen, excuse me if I'm mischaracterizing what you said, but you had the sense that youth vote was definitely up. That we didn't have this, as I say, didn't have the hard statistics, but that was your sense. So I guess let's use that a little bit. And Pamela, I want to sort of come back to you on this one. One of the expectations or hopes among some was that this plebiscite, and taking into account also the comments that others have made about the disconnect between the political class and the citizenry, that in fact this plebiscite would act a bit as a vehicle or a funnel to channel some of that discontent into an organized and a democratic process to an organized and democratic solution. So to hypothesize a bit, if in fact the youth vote is up, does that give you hope or a reasonable expectation that some of the disturbances that we've seen will subside and youth, who I guess were principally involved in the disturbances, will get involved in this process as opposed to taking to the streets?
Actually, I'm very optimistic of the process because I really think that not just young people, but most of the citizens in Chile believe in democracy, and that is the reason why people go to vote last Sunday, yeah, in a pandemic context and everything. But I think that we need now some very important decisions from government, from the Congress, and from political parties and social leaders. Yeah, people last Sunday chose that the democratic way to resolve the conflict is the priority. But that process, the constitution process in Chile, had a lot of opposition in the elite from the right-wing parties, from the government, from some representative in the Congress. And I think that in this day, after a very high approval of the idea of the new constitution and of the approval of the constitutional convention with parity, participation of people that is not from the political parties, and we are also waiting now to include the indigenous people in the conventional, in the Convención Constitucional. This is the time that the government and political parties and social leaders show that all the elite is in the position to open democracy for the citizens. And that is not so clear today. Yeah, and I think that most of people that support the rejection opinion in the new constitution that were the opposition to this process, not just now, from many years ago. Today need to show that this process is for the citizens and not just for the elites. If the leadership in our countries, if government, because they have a very important role today, we have in a very presidential system for, and that's the reason why the government has a very important role today in this process. And from the Congress and political parties, they need to open democracy for the citizens. And that is a very important for legitimacy and the participation of the citizens in the next step of the process. In April, we have to elect the members of the conventional constitution, and that process must be very, very open to citizens to have the legitimacy that the process needs to guarantee stability and democracy for all the people in Chile. I think that that's what the people is expecting on the process, and the role today is in the elites to understand and to change that situation that Cristina said is not just from the last years, it's for a long, long time. And the elites, I think that needs to understand that the situation, the social situation is very different today. And for the stability and for the democracy of the country, we need to open our democracy.
Yeah, just to complement what Pamela was saying, just another, I just want to add that I think social mobilization will not stop because approval won. I think they will continue to mobilize, hopefully peacefully. I still believe that violence will continue, and it will grow as during the process of putting rules to this new constitution and setting up the rules and seeing the candidates and getting closer to April. If there are, and during the drafting of the constitution, if there are things that are being debated that people don't like, they're probably going to continue marching, and the violence, not the ones that march are not the violent. Normally, these are pacific protests, but violence comes after, or almost always, and they've gotten used to it. So I wouldn't be so positive regarding that, saying that this approval just pacifies Chile. It will for probably a few weeks or months, but I don't think we'll get out of that violence streak every Friday or every certain amount of weeks. That's just, and I want just to add, I think people want a democratic process, an institutional process, but they still will continue to participate even out of, not just by electing the candidates or the constituents.
Thank you, Cristina. Claudia, you teach at the U de Chile, and they've been known to have one or two activists from time to time. What's your sense of how this might play out? What's a reasonable expectation? Not just with the violence, but I think more importantly, and sort of what Carmen started us off with a while ago, the hope and that actually this process will engender more student youth. I'm not sure even how to define youth the older I get, but what will that engender more engagement in the process? Because ideally, and not just amongst youth, but obviously the indigenous groups and more women obviously being involved, we're going to come to that issue as well. What's your expectation based on sitting in your office at the U de Chile?
Well, sitting at U de Chile, I can tell you that I haven't seen an oasis of peace since 10 years ago. So when the president said that, I thought it's obvious that he's not a Universidad de Chile professor, because we haven't had a full semester of class since I came to the university in 2012. So I agree with Cristina that there is not a one-to-one relationship between the institutional canalization of social demands and the protests in the street. There are still people who march and don't vote, and there are still some people who don't believe in the political process. But as Pamela said, I also think that most Chileans do want a peaceful and political solution of the process. I don't see this outburst as a revolutionary movement to, burn the Bastille, This is not, I think most people simply want the rules to change after 30 years of politics proving immune to majoritarian will, because our institutions do not allow the popular will to translate into public policy and into political decision. And so I think that the success of this political canalization this political channeling of unrest and of the social outburst depends to a great extent on the capacity the process has to really respond to these demands and not to be kidnapped or limited by elites on the level of redistribution of power. So I think the distance between elites and citizenry is part of the problem, because the leaders who are really carrying out this process are these same political elites who has shown to be very deeply disconnected from the reality. The UNDP human development reports have been showing since many years ago. The 2015 report showed a very large distance between citizens and elites. They asked three kinds of elites their opinion on the role of the state. So the role of the state in life, in things like, so they asked the citizens and three kinds of elites: social elites, political elites, and economic elites, whether they thought the state should have a large role in providing for education, health, pension, and even the copper industry. And the distance was incredibly large. So between 20 and 30% of elites thought the state should have a role on those issues. And between 70 and 80% of the citizens thought the state should have a large role on those issues. So there's a 50-point difference between elites and citizens. And now, very recently, an association of CEOs wanted to test this, what they call this myth of the distance between elites and citizens. And they held a poll among opinion leaders and CEOs and business leaders. And the distance was also very large. They use a category for classifying low class, middle class, and high class, let's say, or I don't know how to call it. And so they asked the people, how do you think the distribution of these three classes according to income is in Chile? And the elites thought it was around like a regular curve, 20% low class, 60% middle class, 20% high class. And the reality of those numbers was 77% low class, only 20% middle class, and only 3% high class. So the disconnection with the reality has also been shown by some assertions of politicians when the Minister of Health acknowledged that he didn't know that there was so much, the people lived so close one another, so the quarantines could not work because of the, I don't know how you say, hacinamiento, that, well, crowding, the crowding of housing in the level of poverty in Santiago. Another minister, right before the outburst, when the subway tariff went out 30 pesos, which is really a very small increase in the tariff, a minister said, well, you have to wake up earlier because from 6 to 7 a.m. it's cheaper, the tariff. Another minister said, okay, everything is expensive, but flowers are going lower, so it's time to become romantic. And another health authority said that people wake up very early to go in lines to get public health assistance because they like to socialize in hospitals and medical centers. So all those things were very angering, I think, to most of the Chileans who are struggling, who are getting higher debts. The debt rate in Chile went from 50% of annual income to 75% because we are growing lower than we were growing before. We went from growing at a 4% growth to 2% growth. So this reduction in growth has led to very pressing life conditions to people. And I think this kind of things trigger also anger and were part of the motive to go to the streets.
Thank you, Claudia. Carmen, I think you wanted to jump in with a comment, no?
Yes, I had a comment following the lines of we had all discussed previously here, and regarding the perception and the disconnection of the elites. I think we've been doing surveys for a long time, and I'm from the CEP, so. And what is interesting is that we ask, for example, beliefs how mad are people that some inequalities, like rich versus poor, like that some people earn a lot more, people are very angry. But then if you ask for the reasons, what it really shows is this against this political elite. They're very mad for a minister of the state, but they're not as mad, for example, they're not mad at all for an inventor, a great footballist, that they earn more. So there's a sense that people that did something. And what it was surprising, at least for us, is that even those rich by hereditary, so sons of rich sons and daughters of rich people are not as mad, or the percentage of people are very mad, but they're very rich is not as high. So it's what we see, and then this I kind of coincide with all the other panelists, is that it's a disconnection from the elite. The Chilean, if you compare, for example, how people want income inequality versus effort, which is a classical question that we do, the changes is not that great since 2010 to today. So people, it's kind of course, like a normal curve. Some people want more effort than equality, but it's not that change. But what it really shows is that people perceive that meritocracy, like effort, would not get you as far. So the percent of people that said that effort in life will give you a good life has decreased a lot. So it's not the sense and this of the, so going back to Cristina, I don't think that the votes for the constituents would show like a revolution or a really change of how people want Chile, but more likely structural institutional changes, as the other panelists have said, to incorporate and to finish kind of abuses. And so I think that's an important point. And in terms of also the youth vote, with people like young people are very pro-democratic. We have, of course, some people that agree in terms of violence, but it's a small group. It's true that it's higher among the youth, but most of the youth prefer democracy. Most of people, even youth and older people, want politicals to make agreements. And what is also interesting, I found, and this is from just after the social outburst, is that younger people are more optimistic. They think that democracy will work better in 5 years than adults. So that also may shed some light on why people voted, because they have, so this is interesting, trust in there's a brighter future, if I might be poetic.
That's a very interesting comment, given what's perceived to be, widespread youth cynicism about politics and like it. Very, very interesting. We've received a number of really great questions about the process going forward from Francisco de Tellier, Fiona Mackey, amongst them. I'll get to them in 1 second because I think it's now the conversation now shifts to, okay, so what happens between now and next April when the delegates to the Constitutional Convention will in fact be elected? How do the political parties play that? Will there be coalitions? How will that happen? But I really want to come to the issue of 50% parity between men and women among the delegates, which is quite remarkable. I think watchers of Chile and a number of people inside Chile might have not thought that Chile would have been the first country to do something like that. But bravo for it being that way. Maybe I'd like to go to maybe Pam. I would start with you. Is how did that mechanism get into place, where in fact it was going to be 50% woman? Was there a battle about it? Was it just accepted that that's the way it should be? Can you give us some insight into what that conversation looked like?
Yeah, the mechanism, it was not easy to agree in the political system. We were talking about the parity in the Constitutional Convention since October, November, when the political agreement for the peace and new constitution was signed about 11 political parties, the political parties that have representation in the Congress. And then a group of 14 experts redacted the reform. Claudia and me were working among that people. And we were talking in that instance about the parity of the necessity of the parity and all other mechanisms of inclusion in the Constitutional Convention. But in that opportunity, we don't have the agreement to include the parity on the constitutional reform to have the referendum. So that conversation was to be transferred to the Congress because of one of the party of the right in Chile, the Unión Demócrata Independiente. Actually, they didn't support the parity on the Constitutional Convention, so we have to transfer the conversation to the Congress. And in the Congress, it's not so easy neither. In Chile, we just have the gender quote in the last political reform in 2015, just because the president was a woman. President Bachelet had many opposition, not just in the political opposition, also in his supporters, to have that kind of gender mechanism to include women in the political system. So it was really hard, but the feminist and women movement in Chile was very strong because the young women and the social movement in 2018 and 2019 had many actions to promote parity, but it was not easy. We have to hear some comments like the women were minorities in Chile, and we have to explain that women is the 52% of the population in Chile. But it was not easy, but we reached the agreement and we reached the votes with some votes from the a main party in the right, that it was Renovación Nacional, and all the opposition parties support the parity. And now we have the challenge to have the women candidates, and that reach the parity in the Constitutional Convention. But it was not easy to reach the parity. So it was a very long way also for the feminist and women movements in Chile for the last 20 or 30 years.
But it's great news that we got
Great news.
I think there's probably unanimity on the panel, including me on that. Okay, thank you, Pam. I want to go now to what's coming ahead, and as I mentioned, some of the questions we have, and they're all really, really good questions. We're trying to do the best we can to integrate them. But Claudia, your name was invoked by Pamela in the effort to get to 50-50. Pamela gave a very sort of comprehensive answer to that. If there's anything you want to add briefly on that one, please do. Otherwise, maybe we should just go to what happens now. Did you want to add a word or two on the struggle to get to 50-50, or words of advice for people in other parts of the world or Latin America, is things you learned along the way that may be useful that others can look at?
I think this achievement really was supported by a social movement again. It was the 2018 feminist movement in Chile, which was also fed by international movements, by the Me Too movement and other struggles for equality among men and women abroad that influenced this movement, and that sort of changed the sense about these issues in society. So we had a much more receptive society after all these years to parity, and that allowed, I think, an agreement that crossed ideological and political borders. It was a very across political lines agreement that gender parity was the right thing to do, was the correct way to go. And I think it's an incredible achievement for Chile, which had only one Congress ago, only 15% of women in Congress. And we've had a very low participation of women in representative politics, even compared to other Latin American countries. And I think the role of the network of women in political science and the network of women in law were very important. These professional groups that had built to promote gender issues in law and in political science were very influential, I think, in this process. I'm very proud of it.
Thank you, Claudia. Cristina, let me come back to you about the involvement of the private sector in that. I mean, there's been arguments often among multinational, European-based or US-based, that one of their arguments for the benefits they bring is they bring the highest international standards on a number of issues, or so the argument goes, and theoretically gender parity, or certainly getting more women into the C-suite and middle management and on the boards is hopefully one of their legacies that they would like to promote. Do you think is there a spillover effect, as Claudia sort of referred to, in this political 50-50 compromise that could also affect workplace parity?
I think that'll take more time. We're still it's part of the process. I think there's a lot more conscious. Multinational companies definitely do a lot more than local companies. By far, they have policies in place for many years now, and definitely they take women up also in the ladder, not only 50-50, but in higher positions within the companies. So that definitely helps. But I think companies and the business sector is still a little behind. I think there's still a lot more to do, but it's a good signal for sure that the constitutional process has this rule of gender parity. I just wanted to go through, Ken, if you allow me, on what comes next, because definitely
Please, that's where we're headed.
What happened this Sunday is the initial part of a long process that will take us first in April to elect 155 members of the Constitutional Convention. That's going to be an election that will take place together with majors, council men and governors, which is first time we elect governors. So it's 4 elections that are going to be very important. Definitely the Constitutional Convention election is, in my opinion, by far more important even than the presidential election in November. And that will, the candidates will have to get registered before January 11, 3 months before. And we will see a crazy 18 months of elections in Chile. The election system is a proportionate system. They open electoral lists in all the districts, similar to the current mechanism of electing the Chamber of Deputies with the addition of gender parity, which probably is something that will change the form of the convention positively. The convention has 9 months deadline, possibly with 3-month extensions. So 12 months after that, since April to April, let's say April 2022. And then after that, we have another referendum, an exit referendum, which is compulsory voting. It is an obligation for everybody to go vote. That will probably take place in May or June 2022. So we have a lot of things coming forward. It's going to be a rough road. It's not going to be easy for business. It's going to be uncertain, more than what we've seen. I think there's going to be a lot of discussion of whether we still want the Chilean model or not. I think there's a big consensus that most people don't want it, but I don't know what will come out of that, what will change. And there's a lot of risks. I think we should not leave this hopefulness and getting this constitutional process in track should not blind us from seeing the risks, because definitely Chile has a lot of good things that we should try to preserve, and that's probably going to be the main thing to continue to follow and to see, mostly for investors. I think investors will not only April be important, but also all the issues that will be discussed and decided in the new constitution. And to end, the other risk is the high expectation everybody has on the constitution as the problem solver of everything, which is not true. The new constitution will not solve people's problems, will not solve health, nor pensions, nor anything. It's great because it brings us a new social contract and it gives us a space to discuss what country we want for the future. But at the same time, we might see a lot of frustration within the process and probably after that. In the middle of all of this, in November, we have presidential elections. The whole Chamber of Deputies is going to be elected again, half of the Senate. And we have, I think, another election of, I think, CORES, regional council people. So basically, we're going to have 8 or 9 elections ahead of us in the next 18 months, which are going to be very complicated to understand and to explain to international investors for sure. It's not going to be an easy road. But I am hopeful that we will get out positively with a better Chile, but we still have to see all these risks and map them.
Thank you, Cristina. Okay, let's go to the issue of the actual process. So the election, putting forth the candidacies and the election of the delegates. Maybe I'll start with you, Claudia. What does that look like? What are the roles of the political parties? What are the roles of, to broadly define, interest groups or recognized social movements to put forth candidates? How does that happen, and how might that look similar to the way the political system operates now, with political parties sort of dominating it, versus something where it actually is a bit more of a citizens' surge, as it were saying that to counteract this chasm between the quote political elites and the people who just went to the polls overwhelmingly, as you said earlier, didn't even want any of the legislators involved in this constitutional convention, wanted to have fresh delegates chosen. How do those voices get heard? Who's going to try and maneuver, and what will that look like?
Well, that's a very, very key question. It's a very key issue, I think, for the legitimacy of the process. Cristina mentioned two, I think, very important things with regard to the way the process will work. First, uncertainty. Of course, there is uncertainty when you are changing the rules of the game. But within that frame of uncertainty, I believe that this is a highly regulated process, particularly if we compare it with other constitution-making processes. This process, as you suggested, Ken, was really organized by the political parties and by the political system through a constitutional reform. So we are going through all this constitution replacing process through the same 1980 constitution reformed. And in that reform, where, as Pamela mentioned before, we participated in drafting the first proposal for the article that created the steps and the way the process will work. There's an article 135, that sets some restrictions to what the convention can do. And it specifically says that the convention cannot take over power from the political system. The convention can do anything but create a new constitution. And while the convention is creating this new constitution, the former constitution is still in place. So there's no question that the constitution will overpass its mandate to create a new constitution. And it has to keep the country as a republic, it has to keep it as a democracy, it has to respect judicial decisions and also international treaties. So it's not like the convention is now the supreme ruler and can do whatever they want. And I think that will be respected, because that was the agreement of the political parties. And I think it's also the common sense of people in Chile. So it's a restricted mandate, highly institutionalized. And as you said, the process will be controlled by the electoral rule of the Chamber of the Deputies, the House of Representatives in Chile. But having said that, the result will not be the same as Parliament, because even though it's the basic rule, it has had already some important changes. For instance, the gender parity rule. We've never had any representative body in Chile with gender parity. So that will be immediately a difference between this convention and an ordinary Congress. It will probably, and I hope soon, have a rule for representing indigenous peoples. The Congress is debating now the rule for having seats assigned to indigenous people who represent around 13% of the population in Chile. And it also has a special rule for independence, which, even though it's not as broad as many people would have expected, is broader than anything we've had before. So independents can have their own lists. And it's very unfortunate that the right did not want to give their votes, so independents can negotiate with political parties their lists so they can be more representative, and it will spread the vote probably in the center left. But the way this convention, even though I think its representativeness is broader than any other representative body we've had before, I think that's not enough to be perceived as a participatory mechanism. And we've seen, especially after October 18, many people going to the streets talking about the Constitution. And also we saw it in the President Bachelet's process for constitution making, which had a participatory phase where people debated very intensely in Chile about the Constitution. I think it would be a great mistake for this convention not to take into account all this participation, all this interest and impulse to participate. And I think because that is not regulated, I think probably the regulation, the internal regulation that the convention needs to approve to begin its work should consider some forms of direct participation by the people, not only in the way of hearings, which is the way Congress works, and we know those hearings do not really influence legislation, but some kind of more influential, more directly mandatory participation by social organizations and by civil society.
Thank you, Claudia. So Pamela, based on what Claudia is saying, it seems to me one of the risks, I mean, Cristina talked about some of them, but it seems one of the great risks in managing expectations is, in fact, this does not become a broad-based participatory exercise in the election of delegates. And then the question is, so then where does that discontent go? If in fact they thought that they were participating in the mother of all vehicles to try and change things, and in fact, not even that panned out. How might that be ensured? Claudia talked a bit about it. What do you think about with those issues?
Yeah, I want to say that I agree with Claudia that the process is very, not just highly regulated, but clearly regulated. And the regulation of the process is a broad political agreement. So I see that the uncertainty that is normal in democracy in election is very short. I think that we have a very clear and regulated process. And this is the first thing. The second thing that I really think that we need to have citizen participation in different ways during the process. This is a process with a lot of participation for citizens. We have the first referendum last Sunday, where people decide that they approve to have a new constitution, and the body, the institution to debate the draft of the constitution. People then had the opportunity to elect the members of the constitutional body, and then people, we will have a referendum to approve the draft of the text of the new constitution. Say that we also need that citizens participate during the debate of the draft of the constitution. And we have some experience in Latin America, for example, in Brazil in 1988, or in Colombia in 1991, where the process have citizens' participation through very specific mechanisms. And I think that the experience that President Michelle Bachelet had in 2016 in Chile, that convoked the people to have deliberation through the constitutional contents, it was very important, and we can have a process similar to that, where people can discuss the constitutional context, and then through a very specific methodology, send his opinions and ideas to the delegates of the constitutional the process. So we have the mechanism, and we just need to regulate, as Claudia said, in the first days that that the Constitutional Convention had to decide his to form to work, so they can include in that moment this this mechanism of citizens' participation that needs to be related to the draft of the text. And I think that is really possible. We just need some political agreement about that. And I think that all the social movements and many political parties are talking about that in these weeks. So I think that it would be possible to do that like that. And I agree that the social movements and the protests maybe could keep going during the process, because people need to feel that they could be take on count on the draft of the text. And that this is a work for the political parties, leadership, social movements to do possible.
Thank you, Pam. Cristina, I saw you moving your head a bit. Did you want to jump in on this? I think you're on mute, Cristina.
I think Carmen might want to say something.
Oh, okay, great, Carmen.
Yeah, I agree with the comments. Like, the process is regulated. We have some the international treaties, so it's not like this jump to the complete void. And I agree that it's important, especially as Claudia and Pamela were mentioning, we have this concern that around mobilizations, and if you see what people sometimes say, is that it's like we need to be heard. So part of the mobilization, the strength is that our only channel to be heard. So in that sense, it's really important that the Constitutional Convention incorporates institutional mechanisms so people are heard indeed. And those mechanisms, we should really try to understand them to avoid common dangers of some stronger group or more organized groups or more vocal groups to take over the participation with respect to other groups. And I'm sure there's a lot of comparative experience, but we should be open to, we should be very concerned about incorporating less organized groups, less organized voices, more marginal voices that are not usual in the organized enough to participate actively. And so we have to look at that. So that's. So.
Yeah, I agree with that, Ken. I know we have to close. I just wanted to touch base on one point that Karen initiated, which is this disconnect between the elites and the rest of the population. I think it's true, but it has been true for many years. It's not something new, but it's also not something to create a war of classes. Normally, this happens in every Latin American country. The only difference is that Chile concentrates geographically all these people. And normally in other countries and other places, you have elites that vote different from the rest, but not everybody lives in the same place. I think it's a territorial problem more than even though I believe there is a disconnect. I'm not saying there isn't. I wouldn't make this a war among classes that is never going to be solved. I think we need to learn, the elites need to connect, and also that the rest need to accept that these people exist and not hate them so much. I think we should also work on that a little bit and try to reduce the hatred between the supposed elites and the rest. Unfortunately, everybody's concentrated in these three districts, which is not the best thing. I think that's a big problem in Chile. It's territorial concentration and lack of integration. I just wanted to end with that because I think
it's a great point. And Carmen, thanks for your point right before that. Was very, very, very enlightening. And Cristina, yes, I set up the last question that I wanted to. I know we're over time, and those who've submitted question and answers, we've read them all, and I think we tried to integrate them into the questioning. We did, maybe not in the exact words that you presented them, but hopefully we got to most of them. And here's the final question in the last couple of seconds, and it plays off exactly what you were saying, Cristina, about hopefully a process more of reconciliation and moderation. And the question is, what's the expectation that in fact that could happen because 50% is going to be women involved as delegates? What do you think what do you think that effect will have on the Constitutional Convention? That's for all of you. We'll make that the final question. Claudia, do you want to start first on that?
Yes, I think it's key that this process really brings us power redistribution, and I think power redistribution will lead to a reduction in economic inequality in the long run. And if we don't do that, I think it doesn't make sense to talk about social reconciliation or things like that. What we had this last decades is really a system where the economic interest has prevailed through institutions inherited from the dictatorship. And that has a very undemocratic component that can no longer be sustained. So I think that some level of redistribution will need to happen. There's no other way to continue in a country with peace, with legitimate institutions, and with a true democracy. Democracy is the government of the majority with the respect of minorities. And majorities have not really had a voice in many aspects because of institutional constraints. And I think the role of women will be very, very important in this. Women have proven to work in politics in a way that is different from the way men work in politics. And we have some studies from Chile, for some of scholars, for instance, in Flaxo, they have written books about the way women impact politics. So it's not only an issue of having more fair institutions where women's interests and needs are better represented in rights, in a gender focus on policy and on all institutions oriented towards gender equality. But also I think politics will work, it will not only affect the way institutions affect women's lives, but it also will affect the way politics works. And I think that's a good news. And I hope this will influence the rest of the political system, future elections, more parity in authorities in general and in power positions. And as I said before, also a redistribution of power between men and women.
Great, thank you. Claudia, thank you, Claudia. Pamela, the fact that it's actually going to be 50% women as opposed to 15% women.
Yeah,
that bodes well for creating a proper environment for civilized conversation, no?
Yeah, I agree. I agree with Claudia say that comparative studies show that when women are in power, all the political system changed. It not just because of the gender agenda, because the issues or contents of the debate, but also because of the culture of the relationship among people. As we have seen in other countries, and even in Chile, what we have 2 times a woman as president, as when Michelle Bachelet was president, the politics could be different. And I think that a more inclusive democracy and a more equal society is also not just the expectative of the Chileans, but also I think that this is the expectative of all the people in the world that is now asking for more democracy, more inclusive democracy. And I think that the role of women in that new agenda of democracy in the world, it would be very, very important. I think I'm really happy that that we in the next election we are going to see the vote with a lot of women as candidates, and also we are going to have a lot of women, not just I think in the Constitutional Convention, but that issue is gonna talk also the other elections, the mayors, the parliament, and everything. So I think that Chile is gone with this democratic innovation. We are going to show to other societies that women can do the work in politics in a different way.
You're here. Carmen, final thoughts on this, if any?
Well, I agree with what Claudia and Pamela have just said. And I also want to point some study that was done on Sweden when they incorporate the zipper quota on the municipalities. And what is interesting, and the name of the paper is theirs, not mine, it's called the quota, gender quotas and the crisis of the mediocre man, theory and evidence from Sweden. It's from like very establishment economists. So it's not like this weird from an LLC. But the interesting point is that it, and I think that will have repercussions because it breaks networks of power which impede not only women, but also capable men of going on. I'm not saying that all of that is that way. And what they find is that the average competence of men increased the most, where the representation of women increased the most. So this would open the opportunities not only for women, but for everyone. And also have a dynamic effect, because many people claim, well, that you don't have the experience for, well, now we have. So I think this is it will have beneficial effects in addition to what my colleagues have said.
Thank you so much, Carmen. Cristina, you have the last word.
No, thank you. I agree with everything all the rest have said. I am very, very optimistic that women participation will definitely make positive change. Chilean society wants change. And I think women together can work to make positive change very effective. And I am sure that if we have 50% of women, 78 women in that table, the dynamics will definitely be different and probably more collaborative, more conversation, more, and it's a great example for the girls and for the boys of the future. And this is the winner here is the Chilean feminist movement that has been able to make this happen, and I am sure positive change will come out from that decision. I agree with everybody else. I think this is going to be we will probably able to see the difference in other things. And like Pamela or Claudia was saying, we will probably see a lot more women in all the other elections as well. That will also create a positive change in politics. So no, I am trying to be, I think we have to be optimistic, but not forget that there are a lot of risks and that we should take also a lot of get involved so that Chile is a better place after this constitution is drafted.
Thank you, Cristina. Well, as you say, if it's a victory for women, then I would say it's also a victory for men and
Yeah.
for all of Chile. And I don't think it's an understatement to say that the whole world is watching to see how this works, not just from how the political evolution works, but also, at least I think for a number of us, how it works for women's involvement and what change this brings to the process. I wanted to close. I want to see if Karen is there and wanted to make some closing comments. I see she's on. Karen, would you like to make some closing comments?
Sure, why not? Thank you again. Well, I'm delighted. It was a great panel. I want to thank all the participants, all of them who are very good friends, and I'm very proud of them. And I agree with Cristina in many of the things she said, and being involved with foreign investors, working from the board of AmCham, we're looking forward to this with excitement, but also with some caution regarding where the country can go.
Thank you, Karen. And again, thank you for the collaboration. We love collaborating with Columbia University Center in Santiago, and with you in particular. This will not be by far the last event we do on this process in Chile. The issues that we discussed in here, we will keep monitoring it, and we really, really hope that we can convene this exact same panel again at some point in the near future when there's more to talk about. And particularly, Carmen is going to have all kinds of new statistics to play around with and to tell us about, and we definitely want to hear about those as well. So with that said, thank you, panelists. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, all listeners. A video of this will be available on ccacanada.com, our website. And Karen, I guess you will.
Sure. We're going to post it both in our website and in social media. So
fantastic.
Yeah, everywhere.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, much for watching, and have a good rest of your day. Good luck to Chile.
Thanks, Ken.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.